After you completed your clay model, transfer it to tooling plastic using a waste mold. This specialized tooling plastic is used by pattern makers in industrial design. In today's video, I am using Freeman tooling products. I'll put links to their website and instructional video channel. You'll often find imperfections in the clay where two lines meet, such as the arm and the torso or the hair and the shoulders. These crevices are often jagged and irregular. Tiny little fragments of investment often get lodged in those little crevices. I have seen many foundries ruin a good edge where they get in there and do inappropriate tooling due to these investment inclusions. By smoothing out these edges as you would a fillet in a wood pattern, the investment will easily drop out because of the smoothness of the surface. Because of the softness of the clay, oftentimes when separating a section for the purpose of creating a mold, it will be almost nearly impossible not to get a little distortion in the clay. One of my favorite tools is neoprene rubber. You can use 3M glue Super 77 and glue your sandpaper to the neoprene rubber. I use a wire brush to clean my files and a paintbrush to apply the polyester resin to delicate areas. The red and silver tools are used by jewelers as belt sanders. You can move the belt around slowly as they wear out. Two of my most valuable tools I made using Harbor Freight diamond round tips, and those were inserted into dowels and glued. The other invaluable tool are Swiss jeweler pattern files. The only ones I could find are on eBay. Along with my hand tools, I use a Fordham flex shaft with dial controls. The dial lets me keep it at a very, very low constant state. This allows me to work very delicately without gouging the work. Along with the Fordham, I use an assortment of rubberized abrasives from jewelers and jeweler tips. For the casting, I use Freeman's Repro 1, and for the filling, I use the Tough Fill line, and the Tough Carve is a softer polyester fill that makes it easier to carve. One thing about urethanes, they'll stick to anything. They'll stick to metal, concrete, plaster. So you want to get a good barrier between your shop floor and where you're going to pour. I'm going to put plastic down so that when I pour, it won't ruin my concrete floor. I like to get ample surfaces prepared, getting ready to pour. It's going to get very messy, so I have plastic on everything. And you want to be able to have a lot of surfaces to hold your containers and mixing equipment. For best practices, open and clean your mold, inspect your mold. Make sure that when you assemble your mold, that the edges are registered. So I separate the mold and I get air and blow the mold out. Checking the registration, it's registered. Make sure that there's nothing. Now I'm blowing the mold out. Cleaning it up, making sure that it fits tightly in its shell. Make sure that when you have your foundry man or your mold maker, make sure that they get nice tight mold registration. There's nothing worse than a loose floppy mold. It is really worth suiting up for this because you're going to ruin clothes and ruin shoes. I'm using very heavy duty fiberglass gloves, or gloves used for fiberglass. It's a good idea to probably put 2 pair on, that way in case one rips you don't get it on your hands. It does contain a type of cyanide that you don't really, it's not good on the skin. It'll irritate your skin for a few days if you get it on your skin. So I also wear a welding hat because you could rub your hair and get it in your hair, and I think I even used the hood. Reprocast urethane has quite an odorous smell to it, so it's best to have good ventilation and wear a respirator. The drill I'm using to mix is an old drill that I don't mind getting paint and gunk on. You can't just mix these out of the can. You have to mix them up with a stir stick. They're really quite difficult to get started. It's like concrete at the bottom of these. I'm actually using a pry bar from Harbor Freight. I'll pry the bottom off the bottom of the can. You've just got to get everything off the bottom of the can so that it'll mix. I used to use the quick cast, the BCC quick cast, and I've switched to the Freeman product. I'm just as happy with the product, if not feeling a little bit better about the product for tooling. It takes quite a while to get this mixed. You can see I'm using the drill, but I'll soon grab a paint stick and really try to work those edges and get every little bit off the bottom of the can. At $100 per gallon, you want to get every little bit you can get. And you've got to be very clean about everything. I switched paddles out, drill paddles. You cannot use do not use the drill paddle that you used in the previous mix because you'll end up hardening your whole material and throwing $100 worth of material out. I went ahead and you want to stand up your mold nice and straight and rigid so that when you pour it, it doesn't fall over and all the contents go onto the ground. Now with just stir sticks, I pour the contents of one into a larger container, gallon container. I think that's a 2-gallon container, 6-quart. Gallon and a half container. I'm using a separate stir stick so I can reuse those quart cups. I mix them in equally, and to avoid too many bubbles, I just stir it by hand. For a mold this size, I find that half a gallon is a good amount. I want to wash the mold material over the surface of the mold and then pour it out and then pour the material back in, making sure that that first surface gets a good coating. I probably could have gone with a little less material on the first coat. If you see the mold isn't quite sealed at the bottom, see it dripping out? You want to seal the mold first, so it's a good idea to go over the seams first with the plastic material and let them seal, and then the subsequent coats will go much quicker, much smoother. But there I'm getting it all over myself. It's probably dripping on me at this point that I don't know about, probably in the leg area, because I'm unaware that it's dripping out of the mold at this point. I've speeded the video up so you can see me washing the material around the mold and trying to get it in the bucket as much as possible so I can reuse that material in a few minutes. Right now the material is still kind of liquidy and it hasn't quite started gelling yet, so that's pretty good. I'm going to set the mold in. I think it's stopped. It's still leaking from the bottom, see? So it's going to get kind of messy there until I become aware that that seal is sealed up. Again, adding as much material, knowing that it's going to thicken and harden. I'm going to try and get it around the edges as much as possible, the outside standing edges. I do this repeatedly with this first batch. Just keep working it around the edges of the mold as much as I can and get as much material in there as possible. It's now starting to set and gel. I don't use the same container for my second coat. I use a fresh container because I don't want to contaminate it, any materials. But I go ahead and I start a new container and I do the same process over again about 3 or 4 times. This time with an addition, I use a chip brush to work the edges, particularly as it starts setting up, so I can get nice thick edges around the opening of the mold. See, you see here I'll use a chip brush here in a moment. There I'm really working the material around the edges and making sure that gets nice and thick in there. And any spots that I can see that I can reach in and get some more strength and thickness to the mold. See, you can see it's going slower now. And I really work those edges with that chip brush really well for several minutes until it really sets up. Just keep working those edges with that chip brush. I saved a lot of material by working this way. So I did 4 coats. That would have equaled about a gallon worth of material. And with this size of mold, a gallon is just about right. I wouldn't do any more. Again, stirring it gently not to add too many bubbles to the mixture. I really rework those edges really well. Now that the mold is set up and hardened, I go ahead and add some great stuff insulation foam that you get at Home Depot or Lowe's, your favorite hardware store. And I fill that just so in case I have a weak spot, a thin spot, that it will prevent it from cracking like an eggshell. Let it get in there and really work its way around the shell. And just get in there as deep as you can and early as you can and just fill it up as best you can. After it's set up for several hours, I cut it with a Japanese saw. Well, here's the moment of truth. Open the mold now. The urethane can stick to the plaster, so it can sometimes not open too easily. So we're going to see if the urethane stuck. Oh, it's opening up quite easily now. The moment of truth. We'll soon see if it is a good pour or not. Peeling the rubber back. At this point I don't care if it breaks. It's a destructive mold process. I use the cheap silicone. Success. Perfect cast. Using my Harbor Freight reciprocating air saw, I remove the material around the bottom of the legs and near the feet. This will make getting under the knees and the under areas able to tool them out. These are the areas that you cannot get in with your sculpture tools when you're doing your clay modeling. It's almost impossible to get in and clean those out there. Now again, when we do these things, we work from gross to fine. I decided to turn on my dust collecting. I have a Harbor Freight dust collection, and it seems to work quite well for these purposes. Now I clean up the flashing, which is the excess material that leaked in between the two mold seams, creates a seam. So that'll be the first thing I do, is clean up that mold seam. This tool is I think it's 1.5 inch or 2 inch Harbor Freight orbital sander. Very nice little tool. One of the most invaluable tools for getting into tight areas and cleaning up those seams is just a good old-fashioned chisel. Now I'm using a Fordham sanding roll. Caution, these can be extremely dangerous. They can fly off like a bullet and go straight into your forehead. I had one fly off and hit me directly in the forehead, and I didn't know if it went into my brain or not. I tried to call 911, but blood was all over my iPhone. I found it difficult to call 911. Once I got the paramedics there, they recommended I go in for a CAT scan. Fortunately, there was no more damage done than a few stitches that I needed. But this could be very dangerous, so wear a face shield. Again, I use a sanding roll. I'm working on the seams. I'm working at a very low speed, so I'm not worried about it just flying off. But you've got to still be careful. Be very light with this. Don't take too much off. It's easy to take too much off. In the area underneath the knees, I use a sanding cartridge along with the orbital. These areas are often neglected by the artists in the clay model because you just can't reach them in the clay. So foundries go in there and they spend a lot of tooling time, unusual amount of time clean it out. Oftentimes there are a lot of jagged little edges which leave the mold material stuck in there, and so the foundries have to do a lot of patching and re-welding. So by doing this, the mold material will just fall off. The smooth surfaces make the mold material fall off. Jagged surfaces create little places for the mold to cling onto and hold into and lock in and give it an unsightly look. Now I start from the top and I work uniformly. I'm removing a lot of the surface because once you get the glossy surface coat off, then you can start sanding and really tooling it. I treat the edges like around the hair, around the shoulders, underneath the arms, next to the torso as fillets like you would when you're pattern making. So I smooth those out so every little bit of investment will fall out. That'll also make it clean up in the wax as well. You shouldn't find a lot of tool marks from the foundries in those areas. So they shouldn't have to do too much tooling in the wax. I've seen foundries put in fingernail marks where there shouldn't be any fingernail marks. So inspect the waxes, make sure that they don't put fingernail marks in the waxes when they're tooling the waxes. Oftentimes the foundry will blame you for having fingernail marks, say, well, they were in the clay. Well, this will show that you didn't have fingernail marks in the clay. I tool the clay as I would stone using round tools like rondelles. So I use this round tool and it gives me this nice elegant shape. When you overlap the lines and slip the lines, you get quite a nice elegant shape using a variety of rounds. Here I'm using the little diamond round that I got from Harbor Freight and inserted it into a dowel and glued it with epoxy. This is one of the best little tools for smoothing off the surfaces. It's just after you've done tooling with the Fordham, you go in there and it cleans it up very, very nicely. Here's another wonderful little sanding tool. You get these at your jewelry supply. They're belt sanders. When the area of the sandpaper wears out, you just slip the sandpaper around and round until it's finally coated. I get a lot of work out of these sanding belts, and there's a variety of grits you can get. This is a neoprene sanding pad. I get the neoprene at your fabric store and then use Super 77 and glue the sandpaper to the neoprene. This kind of work calls for a lot of patience, getting in there and just tooling it, making sure that every curve is beautiful. You'll come across mistakes that you made in the clay, or you can make decisions at this point that will actually make your composition better. So go with try and improve it. At this point I removed a section of the arm because that's going to need to be removed for making the mold, and it allows me to get into these little tight areas and perfect them. You see I'm getting a lot of the surface, the major big surfaces, before I start filing on the hands and toes and face. Just getting the big areas first. Now I level the base and I'm going to apply fiberglass to the base. I should have used my dust collector there, but I do have my ventilation going. Fairly new to fiberglass. I haven't really started working in fiberglass up until only about 20 years ago. You see I'm going to be wetting it out now. Now once again I use the little Harbor Freight reciprocating saw, air reciprocating saw. It's very nice. It does a good clean job around edges and doesn't make a lot of dust when you're working with the fiberglass. And with the base I work from gross to fine, cleaning up the base with the sanding rolls, and then I'll use a finer tool. Now we have a nice hard surface to work into. Now you can see all the low spots and all the repairs by where the white is. You would never have known that you had these low spots in your sculpture until you see them manifest in the plastic. Again, the white represents all the original defects in the clay. Aristotle quotes Plato in his thesis on art. He's quoting Agathon says, art loves chance and chance loves art. And I didn't like the shape that hair was making. It pulls down on both sides of the brow, giving it kind of an oppressive feeling. So I want to free that up. I'm going to remove the hair. Now I look at the front of it. And I see that there's too much repetition and not enough variation, giving it still kind of an oppressive. So I'm going to pull that right back off the head. To avoid mental fatigue, I went right ahead and started working on a different area and let my mind kind of work how I want to handle the hair at a later point. After countless hours of working like this with several different tools and working with the surfaces, I get it ready to prime. We want to spray it with a sandable primer. I keep using the tough fill polyurethane filler and keep sanding it down and working methodically over a period of several days even. Before priming, I put on a darker coat of the mahogany color, and that helps expose another layer of imperfection that we can further refine. When we finally get satisfied that we'll have this pretty close to perfection, we'll go ahead and add a primer coat to it. To be honest, I worked about 4 or 5 primer coats with subsequent tooling in between each primer coat, bringing it up a level to about 320 sandpaper, starting with 60 to 100, 220, 150, 220, something like that. And with each one of these, I would actually put the model upside down and spray paint it in between. I primed it and let it sit overnight, and I was hoping for it to be flawless. You see I have a pencil in my hand to mark, but it's not flawless. I'm finding lots of problems. The primer will expose the flaws, so regardless of how good I thought I was, I'm never going to get it on the first prime coat. As you can see, I pulled the hair back, but it's still kind of funky feeling. Not enough repetition and variation. I'll fix it.